To kind of like hop right into it, like a lot of you are probably wondering a bit about what is kind engineering and how to engineer kindness. Well, this talk kind of came about because I've been in software engineering quite a long time, and especially in the SRE space, you think about like people's attitudes and people's safety. And there, in software engineering, the environment is rife with worrying stereotypes. You've got the Peter principle, you got the brilliant jerk, and they're these kind of dominating things that we think about when we start companies. So how do you be a kind engineer and encourage kindness in engineering? For the last couple of years, I've been exploring what it means to be a kind engineer. It's called different things in different kind of circles, but like for instance, Techstars here in Berlin, they're an accelerator and they call it Give First. I think I had a great conversation with someone from there recently. But ultimately, it comes down to the fact that people who give more unconditionally make themselves happier, make their teams happier, and their companies happier in general. So today, the talk is going to be about some practical tips on how people can become kinder engineers, and how they can breed a culture of kindness in their company. So today there's going to be there's 6 sections. So there's an intro, there's 4 topics, which are code reviews, psychological safety, giving and receiving feedback, and honesty in the workplace. And then there's a little outro at the end with some further reading and a bit about me. So I guess without further ado, I'm just going to go straight into it. So let me just start my timer, make sure I'm on time. A bit about me. As PJ mentioned, I'm in Berlin currently. I'm currently in Germany. I have been here for about a little over a year, but I'm originally from Ireland, and my heart's in Ireland, and I'm actually moving back to Ireland later next month. I'm a site reliability engineer, a massive nerd, and hopefully a kind engineer. I say hopefully because I've never been a great judge of that. I normally rely on other people to say that to me. I think is more humble, but also maybe it's a bit of a brag. So what does it mean to be a kind engineer? That's normally the first question. What is kindness? How do you define kindness? And so I really love this quote from Tanya Riley's talk Continuous. She kind of annotates all of her talks and puts them on her website, and does kind of like a what would you call it, like a write down of what she said. I forget the word. Transcript. She does a transcript of what she said, and it's really nice because obviously I wasn't even in the SRE space when she started talking. So it's wonderful to see her talks, but I really love this particular quote, which is that kind is about being invested in other people and figuring out how to help them, meeting them where they are. And you'll see that that's kind of like a recurring theme throughout everything I talk about today. It's all about putting yourself in their shoes and trying to meet them where they are and not having them and forcing them to meet them where you are. I really think that's the key to kindness. But what has kindness ever done for me? And that's a very common question I've gotten the last 2 years. It's like, the nice guy finishes last. Why would I care about being kind? And I really recommend this book. It's a great book called Give and Take by Adam Grant. It's a collection of studies, of experiences, of stories from people who are givers. So he divides the world into givers, matchers, and takers. And they're kind of I think they're very obvious names for what they are. So givers are you give more than you take. Takers are you take more than you give. And matchers, you give as much as you take. And the majority of the world are matchers. But it shows that giving, especially sustainable giving, which is what kind of the book is about, but is a little secondary to what I'm going to talk about today, shows that people end up being more productive, creating more meaningful relationships and friendships. They're more likely to receive help when they need it. They're more successful, and they're generally just happier. And if that doesn't sound like a thing you want or all the benefits in the world, I honestly don't know how else to convince you. So to begin with, the first of the four topics I'm going to talk about today are code reviews. And code reviews are probably one of the best asynchronous tools that we have as engineers to communicate with people, to make sure that the code is what it is, but also like to talk to people and learn and grow. So it's really important that we get code reviews right, which is why I start with that, because this is the first time you experience kind of like very direct feedback. Um, and the most important part of a code review is you should get the tone right. You should get how you say things right. So I'm going to give 4 tips. First tip is try to understand more of the why and not just the what and the how. So this is that quote coming into place kind of for the first time, where you're trying to meet someone where they are and understand why they made a change, why they did this code this way, um, why they've done this PR entirely. What task were they accomplishing? What were they trying to get out of it? Ask more whys and less whats and hows. And secondly, don't assume malice or ineptitude. We like companies always say we hire the best people. So why don't we as other engineers trust each other to be the best engineer? Um, it's very important that you don't assume going into a PR that someone is inept because they made a mistake or they did something you don't understand yet. It feeds back into more of that why. Don't assume that they're doing it for bad intentions, out of bad intentions, or in a bad faith. They're probably doing it for good reasons, or they're doing it out of just a place of goodness in general. Um, so uh, thirdly, you should ask open-ended questions instead of making strong or opinionated statements. So opinionated statements don't leave people room to present their side of the story. They don't leave room to present the why of why this happened. Um, they don't leave. They force kind of like a way of working on people, which as we become more and more of a diverse kind of workforce, is important to understand that we're not forcing people to do things like that. So asking open-ended questions is very, very important. It's also a really good way to help people learn because they're not on the defensive. Like if you make a statement of, oh, this code is bad, we should do it like this. That's obviously a very like negative statement. But if you asked it more like, hey, just wondering why you did it like this, or have you thought about, scalability or like maintainability, those kind of open-ended questions leave people a much broader room to justify their case and talk about like why they did it or what they did, without feeling defensive. And fourthly, you should always assume that you might be missing something. Ask for clarification rather than correction. That seems a lot easier said than done, but it's a real kind of like skill you have to build. Trying to change your tone and change your language so that you're asking for clarification about why someone did something rather than asking them to correct it, rather than asking them to be like, again, it feeds back into this is the right way, you have to do it. It's much nicer, much kinder if you assume you might be missing something. And a special note about nitpicks. So nitpicks are kind of like the one area which can sort of undermine a lot of the tone of a code review. So they're unimportant comments where the code could be merged without even addressing them if you don't know what they are already. And there are 2 things that you can do to make your nitpicks a lot easier and a lot kinder for people. Is one, you can clearly identify and call out your nitpicks. So if you put like I've got nit in here in like a code block, so that you can easily figure out that this is okay. It's a nitpick. It's something that like I shouldn't care too much about. I shouldn't be too invested in caring about what someone says here. And secondly, a lot of nitpicks may be a sign of a larger problem in the environment, in the ecosystem, such as tooling or process or standards. Linting is a good example. If there are a lot of problems in someone's code with formatting, with variable naming, with how the style is overall, or how they chose to do something. Maybe it's not idiomatic in whatever language you're in. It might just be a signal that you need to add a CI step or a pre-commit hook or something that kind of automatically tries to either flag that or resolve it. And linting is a great example for that. So I did mention the code reviews are a wonderful asynchronous tool, and they are. They're, especially as we are living a very remote life all over the world at the moment. They're a very easy way to kind of like, you deal with a PR, someone reads your comments, sorts them out, and you kind of come back to it in your own time, which is really, really useful. But what I will say is that when it helps, you should know when to communicate synchronously. If you have a lot of comments or a lot of questions, you should reach out to the author directly, because some people don't like a lot of public criticism. You know, a lot of questions indicate there's a misunderstanding here, and a long back and forth of questions and answers is exhausting. And talking will be so much quicker to resolve a lot of these things. People like feedback in different ways, and people can feel that, like, on, especially with pull requests on like GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket or whatever, that they can view it as public criticism, as kind of like, you're doing a shit job and here's all these like nitpicks, here's all these comments, when in reality you just kind of want to make them feel a bit better, feel more at ease. Again, it's kind of that theme of meeting them where they are, finding out how they best receive criticism, how they best receive the feedback, and making sure that you're not, like, you know, dragging them, you're not making them feel like they're being dragged out in front of a crowd and told that they're bad at their job or whatever. You should always be aware of how they like to receive the criticism, and communicating synchronously is probably the easiest, the quickest, and the safest way to talk through someone's problems, through especially with a pull request, things like that. And that's kind of code reviews. Those are kind of like some basic tips around managing your tone, asking more about the why, clearly flagging things like nitpicks that might cause some defensive reactions, and communicating synchronously when it makes sense, to kind of move the conversation along. And then moving along as well, we're going to talk about honesty now, which bears a lot of its roots in the book Radical Candor, if you've read that. And you'll see some of that kind of throughout the next couple of sections as well. So honesty is very important, because it's kind of the bedrock of a lot of relationships. It's about building relationships with people. And one of the things you want to kind of cultivate in a workplace is the being at work bit, is the being just more than just a professional, being more than just professional, care about people and share more than just your work self, and encourage everyone to kind of like do the same. And they obviously, like, people, especially in a remote world now, we talk more about like boundaries, and that's totally fine as well. But I find the more personal you make kind of your work and the way people interact in things, the more trust they have when they need to receive like negative feedback, and the more trust they have when they need to receive like praise. They believe you more. They don't believe it's superficial. When they get negative feedback, they understand it's out of like a place of, I want you to help you, I want to grow, because you need to build this relationship in order to be as honest as possible about how someone can grow, how someone can develop what they're doing. Another thing is that you should challenge people directly when you disagree with something. So this is that radical candor aspect again. You should challenge people directly when you disagree with something. Just don't focus only on the negatives, and be sure to kind of be humble and admit when you're wrong. It's important to challenge people like as soon as or quite close to an event, that can help them grow the most, because it'll be a clear example. They'll feel as close, or the closer they are, the more they kind of like can feel it themselves, and the more they kind of appreciate it. And the kind of final thing I want to say about this slide is that white lies, they're not evil, but they don't help people grow. It's a sad fact. Like, if you placate someone, you're not helping them grow. And a good example of that is like a conversation after a big meeting for someone who's maybe not totally used to it or totally kind of like there yet, um, there's a difference between being nice and being kind, because nice is often that kind of placating someone. It's showing them empathy without really kind of like being honest about what went wrong. So, for instance, like after a meeting where where one of your colleagues gave a presentation and they think it went really well, and like for the most part it kind of did, but the nice thing is you kind of want them to feel that praise and feel that honesty and ride that high for as long as possible. So you say, good job in the meeting, it was great. Nothing else. Whereas being kind is about kind of pointing out that, like, hey, your answer, bit rambly, and you missed the opportunity to kind of really sell people on your idea. But I really like your idea. It's a really good idea. You just need to work on your elevator pitch. And you can see the difference is that, like, I'm not presenting it as kind of like, oh, you think it was great, but here's actually these negative things you didn't think about. It's more about helping people grow, helping people be better the next time, and understanding clearly why why they didn't like get 100% this time. Because what will happen is if you tell them good job in the meeting and then the stakeholders or whatever don't go forward with their plan, they're kind of left there wondering, why did Evan tell me I did a good job in that meeting when I clearly didn't? What an asshole. And the basis of why you build that relationship, of that honesty, is that we want to kind of encourage psychological safety as much as possible. And psychological safety is a personal, wonderful subject of mine. I won't shut up about it. And it's this concept of making people feel safe and feel okay with speaking up in meetings, with challenging decisions, with highlighting problems, with proposing new solutions. It's the safety you feel psychologically in your work to do your work well, and to not feel judged or blamed if things go wrong. It's important to build psychological safety, and there's kind of four, I guess I'll call them pillars, that you can kind of build off of, that you should think about as you build a team, as you build an organization. What should you care about? And so the first one is very on theme with, you should encourage feedback. You need to be in a position where you can show that you can take it as well as dish it out. You should be the first to ask for feedback, and especially negative feedback. After like a project ends or something, or after a meeting or a presentation, just take a little time to gather feedback. Maybe take this structure I really like of like the sprint retrospectives, where you're like, what should I stop doing? What should I keep doing? And what should I start doing? It's basically like, what went badly, what went well, and what can I do in the future? It's a really simple structure. That's a really great way to kind of like get good feedback on almost anything. And it's just, as long as you build that kind of habit of like, after I do something, I encourage people to give me feedback, either anonymously or in person, or directly, whatever people are comfortable with at the start, so that they become more comfortable with the direct method, with being directly critical of what you did. And you'll find a lot of people find it easier at the start to kind of give you praise, and that's totally fine. But you should encourage the feedback as much as possible. By seeking out criticism, you make yourself more vulnerable and more open, and people feel more comfortable and more safe to do it in the future. They know if they criticize their coworker or their boss, or even if you're like an intern, if they criticize the intern, that they're not going to get fired tomorrow because you're going to report them to HR for being like a bit of a dick. Obviously, you want them to do it in the kindest way possible, but you also just want the feedback. You want that critical feedback to grow yourself as a person. And the second pillar is about being inclusive. I mentioned diversity earlier, and diversity is really kind of like the key theme that I think going forward is going to be very important for the world and our industry as a whole. So how do you kind of encourage diversity, or how do you, or what is involved in the psychological safety around diversity? And it's about being inclusive. So you need to keep an eye out for people who maybe don't contribute as much in meetings or in documents, and try to find ways to give them a voice. This is that theme again of meeting them where they are, to try and help them. It might just be that you need to prompt them for feedback in the meeting, or Maybe you need to reevaluate how everyone contributes. Just kind of like keeping an eye out and making sure that everyone is feels safe and feels okay with how things are going and how the feedback process is, how the meetings are going, things like that. You also need to be open to different backgrounds and different life experiences by talking to them and offering to cater to um, their preferred style of suggestions and communication. I mean, not everyone feels comfortable being outspoken in a meeting. So maybe like you share a document around beforehand, or maybe you provide an anonymous suggestion form, just to give them some space to make their opinion heard, until they kind of become a bit more confident, a bit more comfortable, a bit more safe. It's all about building that safety until eventually everyone can kind of be themselves out in the open. It's about being your whole self, and that includes your professional opinions. Um, the crux of this is giving people a voice by letting them express themselves in whatever format they feel right. And then bringing those ideas to kind of like a central point or a meeting or a document or a dance off or whatever you want. And just making sure that they feel uh, good about it, that they feel okay sharing their ideas and their opinions and their problems with everyone. And the third thing, which as an SRE is kind of like a big thing in our sphere, is not putting any blame on someone, not assigning individual blame. Often an individual fails, an individual failure is actually like a failure of either process or environment or workflows. I had this old manager who used to say something that I really like, was that we put you in the position to make that mistake or push that commit, and that is why the team takes ownership over it. We succeed together, we fail together. I love that phrase. We succeed together, we fail together. Ultimately, people feel safer pulling out problems with the process or the workflow or the pipeline when they know they're not going to be blamed individually for, accidentally causing an issue, or doing something based on bad information. There is nothing that will make you feel more like standing on eggshells than being like, say, someone who's on call, but who is like on call after the last guy who got fired after an incident. It's the worst feeling because you don't feel like you have any power to do anything. And that powerlessness makes you feel unsafe. It makes you feel defensive constantly, all the time. And you need to show people that it's okay to fail. You need to make failing okay and out in the open, because it's important for the next one, which is which is turning failure into learning. Um, I think I held down my button too long and it went all the way to the end. But anyway, turning failure into learning is super important. It's part of the whole no blameless thing. So these things are kind of like very intertwined. But it's important to recognize that failure is not absolute. It's not the end of the world. We fail probably dozens of times a day, and we don't always recognize it, but we learn from it. We do better the next time around. And that's the whole thing. That like, I don't think that there is an engineer in the world who has ever not made a problem, not made a mistake. We have compilers that raise problems all day. Failure is part of our job, especially in SRE. Failure is, if you read SRE books from like start to finish, it's almost always about failure. It's like, how do you deal with incidents? How do you deal with like postmortems? These are like dark words. Like, no one died, but we choose them because we talk about failure a lot, and they're very specific. So turning failure into learning is an important step in making people feel safe. You need to make people feel safe to raise a problem. When they see something going wrong, they need to have that culture of not blaming. For example, firstly, they need to not blame whoever is making the mistake. But secondly, they do need to raise it. They do need to raise that there's a problem. Um, it's very important that you catch problems as soon as possible. And the only way you're going to do that is if people feel safe raising them, and they know that I'm not like snitching on a coworker, or I'm not going to be blamed for like doing this. And at the end of it, we're going to be as a whole a lot better, because we're going to like sit around a table and discuss why this happened or how this happened. And so that's psychological safety. Those are kind of like the four things I talked about being inclusive, about like building the psychological safety with no blame, with turning failure into learning. They're all important kind of things. But the thing that all of these different topics feed into is feedback. Like they're all different types of feedback. Code reviews are a great example because that's almost entirely one-to-one feedback. It's just a particular implementation of it. So it's important we talk about how do you give and how do you receive feedback. And first I'm going to talk about feedback in general. Whoops, did it again. I really need to unbind that. So how do you give and receive negative feedback? So, and this also includes positive feedback. Sorry, I've mislabeled the title. But first, I mentioned it earlier about encouraging feedback, and here it is again. Start by asking for criticism, not giving it. You want to be the first to like encourage criticism, to feel vulnerable, to feel open, to encourage people to do the same, to encourage people to recognize that you can dish it out, but you can also take it. And like that's the point of it, is you want both of us to learn. I'm not just going to be a dick one way, and whenever you criticize me, I'm not going to turtle up and like complain. I'm open to criticism, and I hope you will be too. Secondly, don't make it personal. You need to meet people where they are and understand their emotions in these kind of things. You don't want to make the criticism personal. It's not about criticizing them and their ability. It's about criticizing the work or the task. Or often it's an easy thing to do is just to replace you with we. You shouldn't deploy on Fridays, or it should become we shouldn't deploy on Fridays. That's an example statement, very controversial. Not going to get into that. I don't different opinions, but it's an example of like, instead of saying you shouldn't do a thing, it's like, we as a group shouldn't do a thing, or maybe we shouldn't do a thing. Make it a bit more open-ended again. Add some uncertainty into it so people have like that space to challenge it, and talk about their position and talk about where they're coming from. And thirdly, be specific. Be as specific as you possibly can about praise and criticism. You want to give people concrete examples. You want to make sure that they can understand what's happening. Because if you're too vague about it, if you're like, you're kind of, if you say you're too rambly, like we mentioned in the previous slides, it's very hard to like know what was I rambly about, what did I say. Then you've got to replay a whole 40-minute presentation in your head and be like, where did I go wrong? Whereas like, you were a bit rambly when you started talking about like, turtles in the middle of our presentation. Then you went off on a tangent and you started talking about the container ship that's stuck in the Suez Canal, and we kind of lost track a bit. See, that kind of specificity really helps. And fourthly, if you can enter into a conversation about feedback with a solution already, especially if like, well, this is more like negative feedback, but is there a solution for the problem that's at hand? If you're too rambly about something, maybe you could suggest how you can condense it down to an elevator pitch. Maybe you should ask them to do an exercise where it's like they start with like a 30-second, like 2 or 3 line like core mission statement of whatever they're trying to do for their topic, and then build it out, and then add bullet points, and then add paragraphs, and then add titles and headings and stuff like that. But offering a solution is much easier for the person to just enact it, because you're giving them something, a package ready to go of how I can be a better person, how I can be better at what I'm doing. And kind of leading on from that a bit, specifically when we're talking about giving, there are 3 things that you need to include when you're giving feedback, or take into consideration. And the first is the emotion. I sort of touched on this in the last slide, but you need to take your listener's emotion into account, not yours. If it helps, take some time between the feedback. Like if something made you angry and made you frustrated, take 10-15 minutes to cool down, calm down, walk away, take a walk, think about it, and process it a bit, and go back with something that isn't laced with I'm really, really frustrated and angry, and like start yelling at someone, because it's really easy to get carried away with your emotion. It's really easy to let your emotion rule the feedback and taint it. You want to make sure that the feedback you're giving is clear and that it's helpful. And your emotions are going to cloud that, and they're going to make it a lot harder. You should also take your listeners' emotions into consideration. Like, how are they feeling right now? You probably don't want to, you don't want to confront someone after they think they've had a terrible meeting to then tell them why they had a terrible meeting. Maybe take some time again, ask them specifically if they would be open to feedback. Consent is great. Consent is sexy, as the kids say these days. Ask for consent to give feedback. Take the emotions of your listener into account, not your own. Secondly, you want credibility. So we have been, throughout this whole talk, I've been talking about building relationships, meeting people where they are. And this is where it pays off, because you want credibility when you're giving feedback. Firstly, you want to demonstrate expertise, but more importantly, you want to demonstrate humility. You want to show that you can be vulnerable too, and that people are going to be open to this and open to receiving your feedback. It's That's what the relationship all builds up to. It's like making people feel safe and feel like you are coming from a place of good faith, that you're trying to help them. And thirdly, logic. I believe today is the anniversary of Spock's passing away, of Leonard Nimoy. Wonderful person. Logic was his whole shtick, and it should be a key part of when you're giving someone feedback. You should show your work and how you reach the conclusion, so that people can see if there are flaws. They need to see the workings. They need to see how you reached the conclusion, how you got to the point you got, so that if there's a problem or something they didn't know or something you didn't see, that they can point it out and be like, that's wrong for this reason. And then they'll probably give you feedback, and then we'll kind of come on to receiving it there in a second. But that's the point, is you want these three things. You want to take their emotions into consideration and leave your emotion out of it. You want to be credible when you give them feedback, and you want to be logical about how you give the feedback or what feedback you're giving, so that they can assess its meaning and how important it is to them. Oh, sorry, I've been talking for a while now. So specifically receiving feedback, especially negative feedback, can be quite tough. Our immediate feeling is often one kind of feeling defensive, of feeling a bit like, why is this person being mean to me? But it's a key part of growing, and learning how to be better at receiving the feedback is very important. So here are a couple tips. One, you should understand people's feedback preferences, and they should understand yours. Be super upfront about like, I don't really like for instance, I don't like receiving a lot of praise in public. It makes me feel a bit too in the spotlight. I don't like it. So I tell people, I told my team, I tell my manager, like, when you're giving me praise, just say it to me or post it in the team channel. I'm kind of okay with that, but not company wide, So you kind of make people feel like they understand how you like to receive feedback. That's really important. Some people love to receive it in writing, or some people. I have had one person who loved to receive feedback only over meals, only over food, and that's totally fine. That's okay, as long as people know it. Secondly, listen, understand, and thank them. Listen to the feedback, try your best to understand it in the moment, and then thank them for giving the feedback. Because it's really hard to give feedback. You're probably going to be the first to experience that. It's really hard to tell people. Well, it's easier with praise, I think, sometimes, most of the time. But it's very hard with negative feedback, because you don't want to jeopardize a relationship you built. You don't know how people will react sometimes. So hopefully with the psychological safety, you feel a little bit more confident in it. But a thing you can do to make people feel safer when they're giving it to you is to thank them for it. Say thanks. I really appreciated that. And so the third thing is that kind of feeding in from emotions I spoke about when giving feedback. It's also important when you're receiving feedback. Don't react in the moment. Take some time to process, to gather your thoughts. Go for that walk I mentioned. And just try to understand as best as possible what is they're saying, why are they saying it, and how beneficial is it to you. Not all feedback is a gift. I kind of, I, it's a that's a thing. Feedback is like, criticism is a gift or whatever. Not all of it. Sometimes it comes from a place of bad faith. Hopefully that's not happening in your organization, but it's important not to react in the moment to be defensive against it, because your first inclination might be that, oh, this isn't useful to me. I won't really listen. You need to think about it, even if you end up dismissing it in the end because it's not useful to you, or it's got the wrong context, or the logic is wrong. You still need to think about it and make sure. And your immediate emotions are going to cloud that. Emotions are, you might think emotions are a terrible thing from the last two slides. They're wonderful, but when it comes to giving and receiving feedback, they can cloud the message. And you need to give the message as much breathing room as possible so that you get what it means. And fourthly, you want to ask for clarifications or examples. So they should be specific about praise and negative feedback. But sometimes you just need a few more examples, maybe like clear up a bit about what they were saying or what they were asking. Oh, and so that brings us to the end of my 4 topics. I have two slides here. And one is this further reading list, which is 2 books at the top, which is this talk is mostly based off of, with the actual advice bit. And then there's a great Tanya Riley also did a great talk about being glue, which is about the work that goes on between the work and how to recognize and praise it. There's also a great article by Alison McMillan called "Getting Feedback," which I really like. And there's an article about changing company culture requires a movement, not a mandate. And because like a lot of this is cultural work, it's about changing culture and making people feel safe and making people feel open and like they belong. It's important to understand kind of a bit how they do that. And then the last one is my own article. It's Introduction to Psychological Safety. I swear it's good, promise. It's a really good one. Sorry, I'm a little hard. I'm a little bad at at promoting myself, but I'll get better. And so finally, I want to leave you with the summary, which is that kindness is about communication. It's about honesty, candor, if you prefer. It's about safety. The only question I want you to go away like thinking today is like thinking about how can I be kinder? How can we be kinder? How can you be kinder? And so that's my talk. If you want to start more of a conversation, I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn at the Joker's Thief. In fact, I'm most places with the Joker's Thief if you want me. And there's my email. It's me@imevan.me because it's all about me. And the slides are available just above here on my website. But you can go to my website. There's a speaker section, and you can see and download them there if you don't want to go direct to the link.